Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tomiko Brown-Nagin, the Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's program, Anti-Racism in Higher Education, a conversation with Ibram X. Kendi. Our program today is a collaboration between the Radcliffe Institute and Harvard College Everywhere, which creates opportunities like this one for students to stay engaged and connected with the college community from wherever they are during the COVID-19 pandemic. I am delighted to partner with the college in this way, and I want to extend a special welcome to all the students joining us from around the world. Let me also express my gratitude to Rakesh Khurana, the Danoff Dean of Harvard College, for co-hosting this program with me today. This year has been marked by difficult events, which have cast long-standing inequities and systemic racism into sharp relief. These developments have prompted introspection in many quarters, and they've motivated powerful demands for change. The challenges we face can sometimes seem insurmountable, but we must remain engaged, and we can take heart that our program today is one of many discussions focused on combating racism and achieving equity that are taking place across the country. And most importantly, this afternoon is an opportunity for us to think together as students, faculty, staff, alumni, and friends of Harvard and Radcliffe about how to pursue anti-racism in the specific context of higher education. I'm particularly proud to host this discussion at Radcliffe, albeit virtually. The Institute traces its origins to Radcliffe College, founded in 1879 to educate women who, at the time, were denied access to Harvard. And as I've often said, the legacy of Radcliffe College is not merely coeducation. It is the recognition that universities will always be greater when they draw wisdom and talent from the widest possible pool of individuals. A diversity of voices is critical to full and rich discourse. It strengthens Harvard as we seek to serve the world, and it fosters excellence. These values lie at the heart of our program today. Achieving equity, opportunity, and true inclusion is the work before us. And while we work to nurture an inclusive campus community, we must also reflect on the role of institutions of higher education in the ongoing struggle to dismantle systemic racism in the United States. Through our research and teaching missions, and by supporting the open exchange of bold ideas based in insights from across disciplines and professions, universities have a critical role to play in addressing the most pressing issues facing our society. As we explore the topic of anti-racism in higher education this afternoon, Rakesh and I are truly honored to be joined by Professor Ibram Kendi. Ibram is the Francis B. Cashin Fellow here at the Radcliffe Institute. He also is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University and the founding director of the new Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research. He also is the author of the New York Times #1 best-selling book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and its recently published companion work, Be Anti-Racist, a journal for awareness, reflection, and action. Ibram won the 2016 National Book Award for Nonfiction for his work, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. He also is the author of The Black Campus Movement, Black Students and the Racial Reconstitution of Higher Education 1965 to 1972, which won the Du Bois Book Prize. Thank you so much, Ibram, for joining us today. Now for some logistics. Rakesh and I will kick off our discussion with Ibram in just a moment. The Q&A will follow, beginning with questions from Harvard College students, 3 of whom are joining us live. We will then move to audience questions, which you can submit by using the Q&A feature on Zoom at any point during this program. We appreciate you keeping your questions brief so we can address as many of them as possible. With that, let's begin. So I want to start, Ibram, by asking you to talk about yourself and your life experiences. And we'll start there because the book is in part a memoir. And there's a link between your life story and the way you conceptualize racism and anti-racism.
Yes, well, I just want to thank Radcliffe as well as Harvard College for coming together to organize this event, and thank each of you for your leadership. And in many ways, my story is different and similar to the stories of many people who came of age in the 1980s or even the 1990s. And what I mean, especially in the 1990s, this was a decade when Americans really in both political parties, even Americans of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, were commonly considering Black youth to be the problem, to be a menace to society, to be those who don't value education and therefore need no excuses schools, to be people who are so violent and dangerous that they're super predators, to that Black girls were having too many babies because they wanted more welfare. It was all of these ideas that were suggesting that there was something wrong with Black youth. And as a Black youngster, these ideas were directed towards me, and I didn't realize fully how much I had come to even believe some of these ideas, until really reflecting on this book, and really the book opens with me giving a speech as a senior in high school during MLK Day 2000, in which I thought I was so woke and so radical, when indeed the speech was nothing but a litany of anti-Black ideas. And really the book opens there, and it really, as really my life sort of goes, it really takes the reader, and really my story has been trying to overcome this early conditioning that the problem is Black people, and trying to unlearn those ideas that were sort of showered onto me, as it was to many people, to realize that there really is nothing wrong with Black people as a group, and everything wrong with people saying that Black people are the problem, and everything wrong with the actual true source of the cause of inequities and injustices in our society, which is racist power, in policy. And so my journey has been really a journey away from this idea that the problem is people to this more anti-racist idea about what's wrong with our conditions, what's wrong with our practices and policies and structures and systems, and all throughout that is not just overcoming this idea that there's something wrong with Black people, but even overcoming the idea that there's something wrong with Black women, even overcoming the idea that there's something wrong with Black poor people or Black queer people, and I really wanted to track this sort of journey because for many people, they think it's enough to just say, okay, there's nothing wrong with Black people. All the while, they think there's something wrong with specific Black sort of groups or Latinx groups or Native groups. And so that's really my journey, my racial journey. I've had other journeys that fortunately I didn't have to also share, in that book. But I wanted really to share my journey, because indeed the being anti-racist is a journey.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And first of all, let me just add my just thanks for you joining us, and to Tomiko, thank you so much for this connection, and everybody who's supporting the webinar today. So Professor Kendi, first of all, I have to just say, just really have enjoyed your work over the years, and in particular, how to be an anti-racist. One thing that came to mind, I just want to connect it to your observations. You grew up in Queens, New York, which I really appreciated, having grown up in the same place. And you talked a lot about, how you had to sort of overcome the ideas that were sort of inculcated in our own communities about what people are like, the sort of narrative structures that exist. Growing up in the sort of Reagan 80s and in the 1990s, all this terminology. And yet you also said that, these things interpenetrate all of us. They interpenetrate into our minds, into even our own communities. And I was just wondering, from your perspective, how did you begin? What were the mechanisms by which those things socialized? And what was the ways you began, as you said, to unlearn those mental models, to unlearn that in your own upbringing? And I really appreciated the vulnerability you showed in the book talking about that. And I was wondering if you might explore that a little bit more.
Well, for me, it was really the education of experience, and being lucky enough to have people in my life who challenged my viewpoints, either directly or indirectly. And really it began, I talked about that speech I gave as a senior in high school. That was in January of 2000. Well, fast forward, a few months, 11 months, and I was a freshman at Florida A&M University in the year 2000. Now, it seems like a long time ago, but the experience we're having with this election, of course, many people are comparing it in certain ways to the year 2000, when, of course, there was an actual contest, or the election was actually contested. And of course, it revolved around Florida. And I, again, went to FAMU thinking that Black people were the problem, but then I heard first and second hand stories of Black voters or the families of Black folks back home whose votes were spoiled, or whose votes in some capacity were suppressed. And all the while I saw that the national election hung sort of in the balance. And so it was really my first obvious coming to grips with the power of racist policies, and even the impact that it can truly have, on our society. So it was harder for me, right, when I was experiencing so many Black folks telling me, on campus, and hearing and overhearing so many Black folks being subjected to racism, for me to still imagine. So that was really the beginning. And it continued to happen in that way, and just as it happened for many people, this sort of made, that experience of facing that voter suppression, or seeing or hearing about the voter suppression in the year 2000 was similar to many folks this year watching the video of George Floyd's murder, or sitting back and imagining the horrific death of Breonna Taylor.
Thank you for that. It's very powerful, Ibram. Let me ask you to talk a bit about your concept of anti-racism and how it can be applied in higher education. So, boiled down to its essence, I understand your argument to be that anti-racism requires affirmative engagement to disestablish the structures, the policies, the practices that result in racial hierarchy, even if those policies are racially neutral on their face. So I have a two-part question about that. So first, can you flesh that out for us a bit, perhaps giving some examples of facially race-neutral policies that nevertheless are racist? And two, I wonder if you could apply that concept to higher education and suggest a couple of ways that if we truly want to have an inclusive campus, we can do so following this approach.
Sure. So I guess I can blend the two, and let's talk about probably one of the more sort of politically divisive, conversations around higher ed, and that's admissions. And so before I talk about standardized tests, let's talk about, for many highly selective colleges and universities, the number one admissions factor in determining the sort of qualification of a student is that student success on college prep courses. So like AP courses and IB courses, on the theory, and it makes sense that if they're doing well in these courses, they could probably do well in college. A few years ago, the College Board did a study and found, if I remember correctly, that 79.6% of Black students that calendar year or that academic year who would have done well on a college prep course in high school did not take one. 80%, and this isn't 80% of Black students overall, this is 80% of Black students who, based on the study, would have done well on college prep courses, did not take them. So how is that admissions factor race neutral when Black students can't even necessarily compete? And then we start asking, okay, why is it that so many students who are capable, are not taking these courses? Well, we know studies show that guidance counselors are steering them away. We know that in many cases, they're not at their schools. But that's, again, considered race neutral. And we also know that of course, SAT tests are more predictive of the wealth of the parents of test takers than they are the success of students, at a particular college or university. And we also know that white median wealth in this country is 10 times the Black median wealth in this country. We also know that there's a multi-billion-dollar test prep industry where wealthier parents who are disproportionately white and even Asian, and typically the test prep companies are concentrated in their neighborhoods, have the ability to essentially legally cheat. And then all the while, we imagine that student who had that boosted score is smarter than the student who did not have the boosted score. And I think that we really need to reflect and even rethink, those factors. Because, and let me just say that for me, as you stated, Tomiko, the question is not the intention of the policymaker. The question for me is not whether the policy has racial language in them. For me, all that should matter in determining whether a policy is racist or anti-racist is the outcome. And so if a voter ID law is targeting African-American voters with surgical precision, as a North Carolina court stated, it's a racist policy and it needs to end. And I think that it's critically important for us to move away from intention, move away from racial language, move away from even the identity of the policymaker, and start focusing on the outcome and creating an outcome within higher education that's more equitably and just for all of our students and faculty and staff and administrators.
Great, thank you.
I really appreciate that about, looking at the difference between intent and effect. And in terms of, when we see the disparate outcomes. I guess one question, that I would ask in many ways is, where would you start on some of these shifts to structural changes? Like some of what you brought up is a K through 12 shift. And that obviously relates to how schools are even populated, how they're funded, how they're financed. Other aspects have to do with the transition or even the awareness of opportunities like colleges and universities, financial aid, the fact that you have to take AP exams or you don't, or those institutions can reimagine what those kind of prerequisites would be. I hate to push this on you, but like as a person who's so thoughtful about this and obviously has given this great thought in both your own autobiography, but also just observing what would you, if not a laundry list, but what would be the 2 or 3 interventions that you would tell a selective college or university to begin? Where would that begin? What would be the experiment?
I think first I would say to a college can begin by listening to its scholars who study racism. I think that that group of scholars within the college and university have probably been suggesting particular reforms that are specific to that college and university for quite some time. And they may even know better than me. But, if I'm forced to answer this question, I would say that first and foremost, I think we have to even think deeper in terms of, and what I mean by deeper is we have to even reimagine what we consider to be intelligence. We have to reimagine what we consider to be, quote, qualified. And what I mean by that, let me give an example of intelligence. You know, we have been led to believe that the most intelligent students or even faculty member, but let's take our students, are those students who know the most. But what if we reimagined intelligence as those students who have the greatest desire to know? And what if we can measure that, right? I know, I don't know about you, Rakesh, I don't know about you, Tomiko, but I would rather have in my class students who have a tremendous desire to know rather than the kids who think they know it all. And how would that shift sort of how we're assessing sort of students, and how would that even equalize? You know, the wealthy student and the more impoverished student, because desire to know really cuts across ethnicity, it cuts across class, you know, it cuts across race, it cuts across gender and sexual orientation. But I also think that even sort of shifting the purpose of the university, right? You know, I think that the purpose of the university should be that, well, first, let me back up and say that the university is typically housing some of the greatest sort of experts in a particular field, you know, in the community, in the nation. But oftentimes, those experts are not, they're not out front shaping the minds of everyday people. Typically, it's other folks. And in a way that those minds are not incentivized to translate their work for everyday people. Instead, they're incentivized to talk to other scholars. Those scholars are not incentivized to transition their research into evidence-based policy change. And so even the whole incentive structure, you know, I know in the social sciences and humanities, you know, we're not necessarily incentivized to do team-oriented research. But if you actually, the only way in which you're going to answer, for instance, why is it that there are these disparities, or why is it that there's more housing insecurity in a Black and Brown community? You need an interdisciplinary group of scholars. You just can't have one expert at the table. But we're not incentivized in many ways to come together, you know, as scholars to solve common problems that really affect, you know, the world. And so I think even our incentive structure has to change. Certainly scholars are not incentivized to participate in diversity work, right? And so then you have a scenario in which those typically faculty of color, you know, are, because of their commitment, you know, are now essentially being unpaid diversity workers. And so let me stop there.
Well, Rakesh is going to ask the next question, but I do want to note, Ibram, that what you're saying is in many ways music to my ears, because it's a part of the project that we're engaging in now at Radcliffe, really trying to think about pushing or inviting scholars to campus who are interested in these pressing problems and engaging in the project of helping them translate their scholarly output so that the broader public can hear it and in a way that it's valued by the university. So thank you for saying that, Rakesh.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And we're going to look forward, I think, to also hear a little bit about, now that you will have the center, what are the ways that you're thinking about doing that, having that conversation? I'm wondering if I might just sort of dig in a little bit to what you just brought up about, you know, how do we get that, first of all, greater pluralism about the ideas of what research is, the fact that people also want to bring in identity with research about making change in the world, policy implications, activism, those type of things. It seems that one of the prerequisites, and I was wondering if you might help me kind of just think through this a little bit, is to have these difficult conversations, as you've been talking about in your book, about where we kind of are willing to re-examine our taken for granted assumptions, re-examine our points of arrival, and really engage in this hard work. I want to sort of also juxtapose that with a sense that it seems harder for people to listen to each other, or listen with the same intensity that, they also want to be heard. I hear from students sometimes that they want to explore these topics, but they don't know how to do that in a way that would allow for kind of mutual engagement and exploration. What have you found in your work as you take on these really tough topics that require kind of the reflection and kind of almost praxis that you're describing, that allows for that dialogue across different disciplines, but also just different life histories and social histories and different identities, racial, ethnic, gender, sexual orientation, political. What are you finding that works, and what are you finding that doesn't work?
Well, first, one of the stories that I told in How to Be an Anti-Racist were these two Black queer feminists who, in many ways, directly and indirectly, exposed me during graduate school to Black feminism, and I write about the ways in which I was just deeply intimidated by them, not because they were necessarily like, overbearing in any way, but they were just brilliant. And oftentimes we run away from the brilliant folks when we should be running towards the people who intimidate us with their brilliance, who challenge our sense of self, who challenge, our ideas. But the reason being is we oftentimes consider those folks and even those ideas to somehow be destroying us as opposed to constructing us, right? And I think fundamentally, when we think about learning, and when we think about living as essentially a praxis of growth, right? And then how do we grow? We grow just like we grow sort of muscles in which we're constantly breaking down and rebuilding. I think we have to have that sort of sensibility. But I also think specifically as it relates to race and racism and even being racist is one of the reasons why I think people avoid and are really fearful, about engaging in these conversations is because how they define the terms. And so it's this common sort of belief that the term racist is this fixed identity, that is essentially fundamentally who a person is. And what I've been trying to sort of demonstrate through history, through anecdotes, through evidence, is that indeed no one is essentially and fundamentally racist or anti-racist. And why is that? Because, so let's say if you take a person who 1 minute says that indeed that slavery is horrible and it needs to end right now, in that moment, that person is being anti-racist. And let's say if in the very next moment in that same speech, that abolitionist also says slavery is so dehumanizing, it has literally made Black people into brutes. They are literally subhuman. And so when slavery ends, we can't give them civil and voting rights. No, they first need to be civilized first. In that moment, they're being racist. I'm emphasizing this because there were so many abolitionists, as our scholars of abolition will tell us, who held both ideas, right? Just like you had civil rights activists who on the one hand stated that Jim Crow segregation was horrible and needs to end, but then on the other hand stated we need to get rid of all those horrible Black teachers. And so I think that we have to recognize human complexity, and we have to recognize the ways in which people hold both racist and anti-racist ideas, and obviously support both racist and anti-racist policies. And the way we do that is by saying, yes, when you're expressing that anti-racist idea, you're being anti-racist, but when you're supporting and pushing that racist policy, you're being racist, and you need to recognize that so that you can get on this path to be anti-racist.
So Ibram, I think that aspect of your work is just truly powerful, significant, realizing the complexity of human beings and promoting the idea that we all are striving towards this goal of being, anti-racist and truly inclusive. It's so important. We're going to shift to Q&A in just a moment, but I want to ask one last question, and that is about, the wild success of your work, including how you've been able to reach a broad public, and then some of the criticisms of your work. You've had, so many positive reviews, but there have been some criticisms focused, for example, on capitalism or data selection or any number of things. And I wonder if you can tell us which, if any, of the various comments have resonated with you, and which might include which might influence rather your future thinking about anti-racism, perhaps in the context of your BU Center.
Sure. So I would think I wish, as I suspect everyone who's, written a book, there are things that I would go back and rewrite right now, and based on the feedback. And one of probably the primary thing that I would write or write in a future book is what I did not speak about, in a very clear way. And indeed, the way I wrote it, I confused it more than I clarified it, was that racism with an M is inherently systemic and institutional. And racist with a T is inherently individual. So in other words, you have a racist idea, a racist policy, a racist institution, a racist nation, or a person who's being racist. The reason why that's critical is because when we're talking about, for instance, what I was really trying to talk about, particularly, in some of the chapters when I was talking about internalized sort of racist ideas, or, I should have talked about, I shouldn't have used the term, let's say, Black people, because that speaks to a collective group. And when we're even thinking of collectively about a group, we really should be using the terms racism or anti-racism. In other words, are Black people as a collective group engaged in racism or anti-racism? And I would actually argue that historically, as a collective group, Black people have been engaged in anti-racism. But when we're talking about, but really, I was really getting at the individual. And so I should have talked about, really the question that I should have focused on is, that the individual is either upholding the system of racism, or the individual is challenging the system of racism. And when the individual is upholding the system of racism, they're being racist. When the individual is challenging that system of racism, they're being anti-racist, no matter the identity of the individual. And I don't think I was clear. And I wish I could go back and provide that clarity. And it really, a lot of the fact that I was clear, a lot of it came from the criticism, because I'm like, what did I say? And that's what I realized that wasn't clear. And again, you speak about sort of the translation. I mean, for me, what I try to do is I feel it part of the scholarly process is clarifying the complexities. And that is one complexity I just did not clarify well in the book.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. What a thoughtful framing and just self-examination and discussion. I think all of us are always in process. Now we're going to, you mentioned earlier intimidating brilliance, and I'm going to talk about our students. I didn't get into Harvard out of high school. It's easier to become dean. So I'm always just completely blown away by our students. And so we have three of them joining us. We're going to hear from Winona Gao first. Winona is from the class of 2022. She's a social studies major and also one of our leaders in the Harvard Foundation for Intercultural and Race Relations. And so Winona, I'm going to just hand it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Kendi, for sharing your time with us. I was reading your piece from last year in The Atlantic. There is no middle ground on reparations. And in the piece you wrote of reparations, it is a litmus test for whether a person is being a racist or anti-racist when it comes to one of the most damaging racial inequities of our time, of all American time, the racial wealth gap. To oppose reparations is to be racist. To support reparations is to be anti-racist. The middle ground is racist ground. What I learned from reading your work is that to be an anti-racist university, Harvard must also support a form of reparations, and not as this broad abstract policy nationally, but as an honest response to its own history of benefiting from slavery and racial capitalism. That if Harvard does not engage with racial, with reparations, it necessarily sits on racist ground. And so my question is, how important are reparations in Harvard's efforts towards anti-racism, and what would reparations look like? Thank you.
So I think for the second question, I think that's a question that can be answered by scholars who study the issue, because I think the way reparations looks for different institutions is likely to be different. But I do think that it is critically important, not just for the US government, to really atone and seek to repair and seek to eliminate the racial wealth gap. But I think it's important also for institutions to do the same thing, like Harvard. And indeed, it is critically important for Harvard, as well as other institutions, to examine its role, its historic role, and just to not sit there and assume that it did not contribute, because either you're going to assume that you possibly did contribute, and then you're going to do a serious study, and then you're going to repair. Or you're going to assume somehow that you're not racist, you never contributed, which is no different than a president who is contributed to racism and then turns around and says he's the least racist person in the room.
Thank you. This is a really, important topic. And I know that this is something that Radcliffe has been doing. There's a lot of self-reflection also at the Harvard Law School and all of these this examination. And I think it's going to be benefited from the kind of scholarly research that's going on. I know that, Tomiko, that you're leading here as well. I want to turn to one of our second student, Noah Harris. Noah is also a member of the class of 2022. As we had in the version of the green room, the Zoom green room, I had also mentioned that he is our incoming president of the undergraduate council of our student leaders. And so just really delighted that Noah is here. Congratulations, Noah. I just want to hand the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and for Dr. Kendi for joining us. Here's my question. With regard to sustaining pressure to make large institutions anti-racist, are there benefits to thinking about racism, to anti-racism as a continuum? And how else might we communicate that an institution is still racist, but is making important progress toward achieving actual anti-racism?
Well, thank you so much, Noah, for that question. And so let's say, for instance, there are many different ways in which an institution needs to reflect on itself. But let's say one of the ways in which an institution needs to reflect on itself is, let's say, it's faculty diversity, right? And let's say if an institution decides to not just have data on its faculty, on the racial demographics of its faculty, but it also has data on the racial demographics of the people who are applying for positions, the people who are getting interviews, the people who are getting campus visits, the people who are getting offers, the people who are coming, the people who are getting promoted and tenured, the people who are being denied sort of tenure, and promotion, the people who are being sort of selected for administrative posts. All of that data then allows the university to have a baseline and then start instituting policies and practices, particularly at the points where the disparities, are the worst, and then essentially continue to assess its success or lack thereof. That's not something that's unheard of. I mean, obviously there are not many, there are some colleges who are doing that and who are doing that seriously. And so obviously if a college is further diversifying the faculty, or further diversifying their pools, or further diversifying those who are getting, tenure and promotion, that is success. But I don't think the college should then state that it has succeeded. And I think that's the sort of issue. Yeah, I think there has to be a recognition of success, but then there cannot be considered to be that they've succeeded.
Thank you. Thanks, Noah. Thanks, Professor Kendi. Really thoughtful response. And it's interesting how much, for me, even in your conversation and the questions, so much of what you're talking about is a verb. It's like a constant process. It's not an end state. And I think it's really great. We have another student with us, and then I'm gonna hand it back to Tomiko for our other audience Q&As. Gayatri Balasubramanian. Gayatri is a class of 2021 student, so she's a senior. She's a computer science concentrator and a student leader in Army ROTC, and also a varsity sailor. And just really glad to have you, Gayatri, here.
Thank you, Dr. Kendi. My question, so I am a Hindu student, and when I see racism in the university, I see it through the construction of scholarship. So how can we as students and faculty of Harvard community dismantle intellectual slavery? And by that, I mean the Western normative lens through which non-European cultures, like my own Hindu heritage, have been and continue to be disunderstood and written into history as inferior.
Well, I think you could probably answer that question, but what I would say is first and foremost, there has to be an acknowledgement, that indeed there is intellectual sort of slavery, that indeed the curriculum is colonized, that indeed many of the thinkers who introduced and founded anthropology or sociology or history or literature or you name the discipline, that many of some of those scholars were on the faculty even at Harvard, when they created and advanced that form of scientific racism. And so there has to be an awareness of its existence currently. There has to be an awareness and a tracking of its history. But I think, and that then gives us the lens to begin to dismantle its sort of continuous use. The reason why, for instance, my colleagues and I were deliberate in naming our center at BU the Center for Anti-Racist Research, because we wanted to speak to the heart of this. We wanted to say, you know what, there's racist and there's anti-racist research that's built on different types of basic assumptions that have long been at war within the intellectual community. The basic assumption that if there's an inequity, that it's because there's something wrong with people, or the basic assumption that European culture is not European culture, it's human culture, and that every culture should be assessed from that sort of European cultural standard. No, those are racist constructions. And indeed, we have to, as scholars, do the complex work of equalizing difference. It's easy for us to just assess, cultures from the normative standards of white people that's been taught to many different folks. It's much harder for us to really conceptualize different cultures and learn different cultures, and even not assess other cultures from our own cultural standards. It's much harder. That's the irony, is the people who consider themselves the smartest do the easiest work. It's much harder, to appreciate cultural diversity. It's much harder to ask the question, well, what's wrong with systems and structures and policies and conditions, than it is to say, well, what's wrong with those Indian Americans? What's wrong with those Black Americans? What's wrong with those Native? It's much easier to ask that question and then claim there's something wrong with them culturally or behaviorally. But then those very scholars imagine that they're the most superior.
Thank you. I'm gonna hand it back now to Tomiko. We have some questions coming from the audience.
Indeed, we do. Thank you so much. And they're good ones. The first that I want to pose to you, Ibram, is this one. How do you feel the Black Lives Matter movement has affected public awareness of what it means to be anti-racist? And from both an individual and a societal perspective, how can we keep that momentum and accountability alive so that actively educating oneself to be anti-racist is a long-lasting endeavor?
Well, I would answer the second question very simply, for us to realize that no one becomes an anti-racist. It is only something we can strive to be. And so that's what keeps us. It's a destination. There is no destination. It's a journey of really consistently ensuring that we're supporting anti-racist policies and policymakers, and that we're articulating anti-racist sort of ideas, and we're constantly unlearning this conditioning. But I think for the first question, I think it's been just absolutely critical. The call, let's understand the context in which, how and why those three words, Black Lives Matter, came to become sort of one of the defining three words of our time. You literally had, not only did you have Black people, particularly unarmed Black people, dying consistently or being killed or murdered by police, but you also had society then blaming those Black people for dying. Then you had many prosecutors and other officials basically not bringing charges to those officers who killed, or in the case of some, not bringing charges. And so what did that say? What did that say for Black folks? What did that say for folks who love Black people? That Black lives do not matter? No, but Alicia Garza was like, no, Black lives do matter. And all of those folks who are Black and even who are not Black, who value Black life, and to value Black life is an anti-racist value, of course, latched on to that term that indeed all Black lives sort of matter. And so I know it's been everything for me. I know it's been everything for many people. And indeed, I wrote both Stand from the Beginning and How to Be an Anti-Racist during the Black Lives Matter era, inspired by those three women who conceived of or popularized, that term.
That's great. And I'm really happy that you mentioned that you wrote the earlier book during the Black Lives Matter era, because of course it's been ongoing. It has newly captured the public imagination after the killing of George Floyd, but this movement has been going on for a very long time. And I can remember, giving a talk not too long ago when Black Lives Matter did not, it was not considered, it was considered controversial, the movement. And so
Yes,
that change has happened relatively recently. So a second question. In her book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, Isabel Wilkerson presents a strong case that racism in the US is a manifestation of a caste system that was transported to North America from Europe 450 years ago. So she seems to argue that unbuilding racist power structures and policies and repairing their devastation necessitates the elimination of the American caste system, that addressing racism separately won't get us there. And this questioner would like for you to react to that.
So I think one of the reasons why, even in How to Be an Anti-Racist, I wanted to have a conversation about, not only racism, but also ethnocentrism, but also notions of cultural hierarchy, but also capitalism, but also sexism, but also homophobia, is because I wanted people to understand that racism is indeed one form of bigotry, and it's indeed intersecting with other forms, of bigotry, other forms of bigotry that are leading to many different forms of injustice and inequity. And to truly create an anti-racist society, we have to challenge every sort of form of bigotry. Now, whether we're going to call those collective forms of bigotry a caste system, or whether we're going to call it bigotry, I mean, I think if folks want to call it caste, I'm perfectly fine with that. They want to call it another term, I'm perfectly fine with that. But I agree with the principle that indeed it's part of a larger sort of system that we need to dismantle.
Right, thank you. Another question. To impact racism, we especially need to win white workers over to progressive policies. How does your anti-racist framework apply to organizing, working at the grassroots in the community, at the workplace, or working at the policy making level?
Well, I think that in some cases it is helpful to win over white workers, but I don't want us to necessarily say that is across the board. But I think in many cases it is important for white workers to realize the ways in which they're being sort of oppressed by capital, that capital is using racism, and has historically used racism, to maintain their oppression. And when those white workers are reinforcing racism, they're reinforcing their own oppression. That's what I think scholars of racial capitalism have long sort of made the case, going all the way back to W.B. Du Bois, who of course who articulated this idea of the wage of whiteness. And I think it's important for white workers to use Malcolm X's terms to realize that they've been had, that they've been took, that they've been led astray for quite some time. They've been led astray because indeed, if they can come together with Black workers and Latinx workers and Native and Asian, workers, they'd be much stronger.
Right, thank you. This question is about failure. I wonder about the importance of failure as we do this work at every level, specifically in higher education, where there doesn't seem to be room to fail. The pressure to get things right at the first attempt seems only to reinstate to a paradigm of racist policy, which then abandons the inclination to try to effect change systematically. Do you have any thoughts about leaving space for failure as an important step on the journey towards anti-racism in higher education?
So, for instance, let's say we were talking earlier about faculty diversity, and let's say if a college institutes a new policy that another college instituted that allowed for their faculty to be diversified. So they instituted at their college and it failed. Then what happens next? That college says, you know what, this policy didn't work. Not those Black faculty or Latinx faculty, the policy didn't work. So we need to go back, to the drawing board. When we're focused on outcome, that allows us to consistently, if we fail, we continue moving along until we succeed. And we consistently are seeking to change or improve policies, until we succeed. And even when we succeed, we then have to be vigilant in maintaining those policies so that success continues.
Great. And I'll end with one final question. I think I probably know the answer to this, but let's put it out there. Would you support and/or advocate for a policy mandating anti-racism course requirements for all undergraduates through a school's Common Core?
Yes.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. Rakesh.
Well, I just want to, first of all, just thank you so much for what you've shared with us today, for your presence, for your just taking questions in such a thoughtful and responsive way. I mean, it is a challenging time in our society. And it's hard not to be an educator and believe that knowledge has a place and education has a place in actually changing the world. That if we can change the way we think and understand, we can change ourselves and we can change our world. And you have given us an incredible opportunity this afternoon to engage in that kind of conversation. To put ourselves in through your books. And again, I just want all of them. I encourage all of our viewers to engage with them, to put yourself in the perspective of someone else, to see behind other people's eyes, to hear from their perspective. It goes right to the possibilities for new futures and alternative futures. The vulnerabilities you've shown even in our Q&A shows us that authenticity is the solution, not our perfection. Or the performance of perfection, that authenticity is. And you've just really modeled that for us today. I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to Radcliffe for this partnership, and especially grateful to everybody who's asked questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I want to just again give a special shout out to our students for really helping us, and to Professor Kendi. Thank you so much. We're lucky to have you part of the New England and Boston community, and we look forward to working with you and learning so much from you.